Somebody called me last week and they said, do you remember when you were here before, you used to tell us some little jokes, mirth moments, before, just to sort of loosen us up a little bit, get a life, you know, and he said, why don't you do that? And I said, oh, yeah, okay, maybe it's time. The Lord loves laughter in the house. So here are some good jokes that I can share with you by way of mirth moments. They're jokes that you would tell your grandmother, I hope. And I solicit jests for Sunday morning, if you have any. This is entitled, What If Biblical Headlines Were Written in Today's Press? On the Red Sea crossing, wetlands trampled in labor dispute. Pursuing environmentalists killed. Inquiry promised. On David and Goliath, hate crime kills beloved champion. Psychologist questions influence of rock. On the birth of Jesus, hotels full, animals left homeless. Animal rights activists enraged by insensitive couple, charges pending. On feeding the 5,000, preacher steals child's lunch. Disciples mystified over abusive behavior. Maybe the Bible would never have been written if we'd had the press to watch us. I wanted to talk about victimization today. Yes, because there's a lot of victimization in our world, much of it genuine and terrible, but many of us do experience a species of victimization in our own lives, perhaps generated when we were young, perhaps as a result of, again, not measuring up to what other people imagined we ought to achieve. Victimization is with us. There's no doubt about that. And it can be very damaging to many of us who experience it in our spiritual understanding, in our pursuit of the spiritual way. So we need to learn to deal with victimization. You can put this in the category of Lenten cleansing, if you want, which was what we tried to do yesterday with some nasty states of mind. But first I want to read you a story of a classic victim. And this is Joseph, reading from the book of Genesis. Joseph, you remember, had his coat of many colors. Bible scholars don't use that expression much anymore. They like to think that it was a long-sleeved coat instead. But I suppose it really doesn't matter. But when Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped him of this precious long-sleeved robe, which his father had given him. Obviously, they were jealous. They took him and threw him into a pit. And the pit was empty, and it had no water in it. Terrible thing. But Midianite merchants passed by, and they drew Joseph up out of the pit. Not with any positive intention, alas, because they sold him for 20 pieces of silver to Ishmaelite traders who brought him to Egypt, where he became a servant in the house of a wealthy Egyptian. Well, he prospered in that situation, as you remember the story, but he was charged again with a crime that he didn't commit, thrown into jail, but once again, he refused to accept that role of victim, which, after all, I think he was entitled to imagine was his. Wouldn't you feel victimized if your relatives threw you in a pit without any water and you got sold into slavery as a result? I think most of our relatives, if they wish us ill, I hope at least, are dealing in slightly less blatant terms. But Joseph certainly had justification for thinking that he was victimized. But Joseph had what a couple of my New York friends call chutzpah. He was not going to accept that victim role. He refused. As I say, nobody was better entitled to accept it, but he refused. He wouldn't do it. He'd found that spirit, that light of God within himself, and he was not going to let anything obscure that. He was going to let that shine. And he did. And he achieved, we know, a tremendous amount as a result. He's always been sort of the classic victim who refused to accept the role. Now, I want to be clear. There are still, of course, many, many, many genuine victims in this world. What a tragedy it is. Children, innocent children all over the world. The poor, the elderly who suffer unnecessarily. Women who have had their lives distorted merely because of their gender. I mean, you could go on and on describing genuine victims. But at the same time, for every one of those victims, there always seems to be someone who transcends that victimization, breaks free, is able to discover the power within him or herself and go forward and express the light. Doesn't take that victimization on. When I was a kid, I used to walk to school every day, and I used to walk with a friend. He was a little bit older than I, and we used to walk together. We had some interests in common. We were only about 9 or 10 years of age, but we were often set upon by this group of guys who beat us up. It was kind of a regular occurrence. They did it in part because we went to a better school than they, or at least they thought we went to but we didn't think we went to a better school, but they thought so. But mainly, they beat us up because, guess what? My friend was Catholic. And there was so much anti-Catholic prejudice in that town that these kids would bully and beat us and beat me up for being with him. Guilt by association. I didn't tell anybody. You didn't squeal in those days. You kept quiet. You accepted these things. But I remember feeling keenly that I was victimized as a result of that. But, you know, I learned to overcome it and move forward. But I met my friend, Peter, some years later, and to my distress, he had accepted that role. He had taken on the role of victim. He had become apologetic. He had suffered greatly in his emotional life, in his psychological life, and it had affected even his physical life. And I thought, what an absolute tragedy, because this is a very bright boy, man, who had just fallen right into this role and accepted it. And ever since that time, whenever I've worked with people, I've looked for the evidences of victimization in their thinking. And I've tried to help them to eliminate it, because not only are they giving strength to those who try to victimize them, letting them win, if you will, they're needlessly destroying their own magnificent opportunities that could shine if they didn't always have this feeling of victimization that drags them down. I told the story this morning of a Jewish rabbi whom I knew very well, and he was in Germany. He was German, and of course you know what happened in the... Now, he's long past, but you know what happened in the 1930s to Jews in Germany. They weren't immediately annihilated. That was a terrible, terrible tragedy that occurred a little later in the war and especially affected Jews in the East. But he was sent to a concentration camp, Konzentrationslager, which is not a death camp, but it was so horrifying to be in one of those that you were expected to die anyway. You were overworked or starved or whatever, or beaten. So he put up with that for some years. His family, of course, vanished. And before the war ended, he was, in fact, sent to the east, to a death camp, where, of course, he expected every day to die. And yet, I knew him, probably 30 years ago. He was a remarkable man who spent his entire life working amongst the disadvantaged in one of our big cities. He had come out of what he preferred to call the Shoah. Many Jewish people don't like to use the word Holocaust, and there are reasons for this, theological and other reasons that we don't have to go into. But the Shoah means the tragedy or the unfortunate thing. And he was a victim of this, and he'd lost his entire family. Now, surely a man who had been through what he had been had his fellow human beings despise, threaten him. Every day promised that he wouldn't survive for the next 24 hours. He had suffered that victimization. Surely, you would say, nobody is better entitled to claim victimization than this man, and yet he didn't. He wouldn't. I asked him, I said, you're a victim. How have you overcome this feeling? He said, I won't give them the satisfaction. Because he said, I know I have something in me that is stronger than anything anybody can do to me. And I want to let that presence shine. I want to show that we can live up to higher standards. And he'd spent his life subsequently in this remarkable display of compassion and love to his fellow human beings. Didn't matter whether they were Jewish or any other religion. That was what he did. And I thought, what an incredible lesson, what a wonderful lesson that is. To not allow those who have had power over us, who have tried to victimize us, not let them win and have the final say. Or maybe it's circumstances. Maybe the IRS has victimized you. Maybe illness has victimized you. We often accept that role and say we have been victimized in that sense. But we must not allow it to happen. We cannot. Now, having said that, having said all of that, there's a sneaky little addendum here that I'm going to slip in. Do you know that some of us, self-included, some of us do use victimization to get that little extra bit of sympathy and to say, well, I could or I would have done it if I hadn't been the victim. Maybe of the devil. The devil made me do it. That's a good one, actually, because it's very hard to refute that. The devil made me do it. But we do get a little bit of extra, maybe a little bit of extra chicken soup. If we, this cold like a cat. I mean, I've been a victim of this cold for a week, and take another couple of days off from work, and it's a temptation, isn't it? I mean, we all do it. And that's understandable. That's human nature, because the fundamental driving force of human nature is self-preservation. And anything we can do to add to that self-preservation, make life a little easier, make self-preservation itself a little easier, we're naturally going to take it. And if getting a little extra mileage out of victimization, if that really helps, okay, we're not averse to doing it. A human foible, a failure. But it's when that becomes internalized and becomes part of our fundamental psyche, part of our overall psychology, and we just live in that consciousness, whether it's justifiable, we have been horribly victimized, like my rabbi friend, or whether it's something that happened a few years ago in childhood or in school, it's equally damaging to our spiritual growth and maturity. We don't need that sense of victimization. And alas, there are some people who have come from religious backgrounds where they were cast as victims. And all, I think, in an effort sometimes to control and manipulate rather than free. Anybody who is interested in freeing us will tell us that we are in truth free. Nobody can crush or victimize us unless we let them. That's one of the great messages we have in unity. Nobody can, it may seem very odd to you, nobody can hurt us, really, truly, unless we let them. And when we let them, they win, and we lose, because we diminish that glorious light of being in ourselves. We tell it, we don't trust it. It will see us through every eventuality, because eternal life, that gift of light and creation, is ours. Nobody can take it from us. When we accept victimization, we're in effect saying to that which made us, well, you made a kind of a flawed thing here. No, no. We were made. We were made to learn and to grow and to live and to flourish and let our light shine. So we don't do the victim role. We get a little bit of mileage sometimes in a teeny little way from it. Okay, that's understandable. But if you have ever accepted that role in a serious sense, or you feel you have a genuine claim to victimization, accept it, if you will, that it happened, but don't let it have power over your life, because it holds us back in the most savage ways, and sometimes the most cruel and most unacceptable ways. The light has to shine, and it shines victorious. Victorious. We are victors in truth, never victims. I'll shut up.